"Brother, you killed all these swift mantises." Su Xiaoqiao saw no one except for the guy in golden armor. The dead mantises were still bleeding, so they couldn't have been dead for long. Su Xiaoqiao couldn't believe that someone was able to kill so many mantises in such a short amount of time. Although the swift mantis was only a primitive creature, considering the sharpness of its forelegs and its speed, even those who had maxed out on primitive geno points didn't dare to provoke it. After all, there were too many weak spots on human body, and no one wanted to risk losing his life or getting severely injured from a mantis cut. There were at least 3 dozen dead swift mantises on the ground. Even Qin Xuan would need some helping hands to achieve this. Su Xiaoqiao wouldn't believe that someone could have done it alone. Want some? 1,000 Levo dollars each. Han Sen was just considering what to do with the mantises. He was on a killing spree and forgot the fact that there was no way he could eat so much mantis meat. And even if he could eat them all, only the first few could gain him geno points. 1,000 each. Are you sure? Su Xiaoqiao looked at him, surprised. Although many people were able to hunt primitive creatures, they were in short supply, especially the ones that most people had never eaten, like swift mantis. After all, people's energy was limited, and there was a limit to how many geno points the meat from the same type of creature could offer. Su Xiaoqiao calculated and figured that he could double or triple the price if he could transport these mantis' bodies back. Yes, 1,000 Levo dollars each. Han Sen nodded. It wasn't that Han Sen did not know what the mantises were worth. Without a car or other tools, there was simply no way he could move all these bodies back on his own. And if he left now, the bodies might be stolen when he returned. Moreover, Han Sen did not want to waste his time and energy on this. He had more important things to do, and he could take some loss of the profits. As the wholesaler, he had to leave some profit to the retailer. A total of 43. I'll give you a discount and charge only 40,000. Han Sen was just casually asking and did not expect this ordinary-looking guy to be so rich that he could buy them all. Su Xiaoqiao took out his wallet and pulled out 10 $10,000 notes. "Brother, I'll give you 50,000 for these mantises. The other 50,000 is a down payment for whatever good stuff you may have in the future. I'll always give you a good price and would pay even higher for mutant creature flesh. If you have mutant creature flesh to sell, do let me know. The price is definitely not a problem." Su Xiaoqiao boasted, afraid that he might lose this great opportunity. "Great. What's your name and address? I will come and find you if I have something." Han Sen appreciated Xiaoqiao's generosity and thought he might be an ideal buyer for the mutant creature he planned to produce using the black crystal. "Brother, my name is Su Xiaoqiao, and that's my real name. My room number at Steel Armor Shelter is 1046. How about you? What's your name and where do you live?" Su Xiaoqiao said. "Dollar. That's the only thing I care about. Prepare some money, and I'll go to room 1046 once I have something." Han Sen put the money into his pocket, waved goodbye to Xiaoqiao, and left Zephyr Valley. Having been through his father's death, Han Sen did not want to have too many exchanges with others. He just wanted to take care of his mother and sister and do his own thing. Other people or things didn't really affect him. "Brother, I'll wait for you. You must come. Remember, the price is definitely not a problem." Su Xiaoqiao shouted at the back of Han Sen while waving his hand. After Han Sen left, Su Xiaoqiao couldn't help but call out, "How could I get these back?" Su Xiaoqiao thought for a while and decided to carry some back in a bag and ask some friends to help him carry the rest. Fortunately, there were almost no humans in Zephyr Valley. When Su Xiaoqiao came back with friends, all the bodies were still there. "Xiaoqiao, is it true that Dollar killed all these swift mantises?" Su Xiaoqiao's friends looked wide-eyed at the pile of mantis bodies. "Of course, although I did not see him hunting. There was no one else in Zephyr Valley at the time and the mantises had just died. Who else could it be?" Su Xiaoqiao said. "I think it must be a gang of people that killed these swift mantises, and others must have left him to deal with the bodies. I don't believe one person could kill so many mantises. He must be bragging." He was definitely bragging. None of Su Xiaoqiao's friends believed Han Sen killed the swift mantises alone. Han Sen didn't go back to Steel Armor Shelter after leaving Zephyr Valley. In a flash, he killed every swift mantis in a frenzy so that there were none left. "Well, I'll just go hunt a copper-toothed beast. There are plenty of them near Steel Armor Shelter and there is a high chance of catching a mutant copper-toothed beast, so it wouldn't seem too suspicious if I were to produce a mutant one using the crystal." Han Sen found a habitat of copper-toothed beasts and wanted to catch one that was alone. Only able to find a small group of copper-toothed beasts, Han Sen went ahead and killed all of them but one, taking advantage of his tough armor. Primitive creature copper-toothed beast killed. No beast soul gained. Eat the flesh of copper-toothed beast to gain 0 to 10 primitive geno points randomly. primitive creature Copper-Tooth Beast killed. Primitive Beast soul of Copper-Tooth Beast gained. Han Sen's eyes widened in surprise. The 43 swift mantises and thousands of ordinary creatures he had killed didn't render a single beast soul. Now he had killed only 2 Copper-Tooth Beasts and gained a beast soul. To get a beast soul requires pure luck. Han Sen was filled with joy. Although it was common, the beast soul of a Copper-Tooth Beast was quite nice to have. The Copper-Tooth Beast was one of the weakest among all primitive creatures, but its beast soul was popular. Han Sen summoned the new beast soul, and a porcupine-like shadow with bronze fangs shifted into a bronze crescent spear in his hand. The crescent spear had a bronzy sheen and a menacing look with its crescent-shaped spearhead. Type of primitive beast soul of Copper-Tooth Beast, weapon. Han Sen played with the spear for a while, looking quite fierce. He was taught basic spear skills at school. Han Sen was interested in all kinds of weapons, so he learned well. Han Sen put away his spear before he grabbed the living Copper-Tooth Beast and went back. On his way back, he found a lonely spot to remove his armor. Looking like himself again, Han Sen went back to Steel Armor Shelter, carrying the knocked out and tied up Copper-Tooth Beast on his shoulder. At the gate of the shelter, a gang of about a dozen people were marching out, all riding on different tall beast soul mounts, headed by a man wearing steel armor and carrying a blood-red sword on his back. The man was riding a Triceratops-like beast soul mount, looking mighty and majestic, attracting envious glances from all around. In Steel Armor Shelter, there are 3 outstanding persons who aim to complete evolution by maxing out on sacred geno points. This man, Son of Heaven, was one of them. Han Sen didn't know his real name and identity, but he was definitely a king in Steel Armor Shelter. Carrying the Copper-Tooth Beast, Han Sen stepped aside to let the gang pass. However, Son of Heaven stopped his mount when passing by him. Crack! Son of Heaven looked at Han Sen and slashed him on the shoulder with a leather whip. The Copper-Tooth Beast fell on the ground, and Han Sen's clothes were ripped apart. A wound started to swell on his shoulder and back. Who had the nerve to sell you this primitive creature? Son of Heaven asked in a cold tone, looking down at him condescendingly. In Steel Armor Shelter, everyone knew that Son of Heaven was wooing King Xuan. Ass freak who stabbed King Xuan in the rear naturally became his enemy. He was also one of the reasons why Han Sen was miserable. When learning King Xuan was stabbed, Son of Heaven not only had Han Sen beaten up but also let everyone know that whoever would dare to do business with Han would become his enemy for life. I hunted it myself. Han Sen stared back coldly, fists clenched but standing still. Not only had Son of Heaven gained a lot of geno points, but he also had collected many beast souls. Since he had help from his gang, Han Sen wouldn't be able to touch the guy even with his best effort. Even with his sacred blood armor, he would be beaten to death before he approached Son of Heaven. If I find out that someone dares to sell to you, I'll make sure you both die in pain. Son of Heaven looked around and rode away. Ass freak, don't make trouble, or else I don't mind teaching you another lesson. Han Sen watched the gang going away with fire burning in his eyes. He picked up the Copper-Tooth Beast quietly and walked towards Steel Armor Shelter, with everyone watching him with derision. Stronger, I need to become stronger. With scorching anger in his chest, Han Sen knew he was far too weak to fight the gang on his own. The Black Crystal, however, was his biggest opportunity. Son of Heaven, just get rid of him for good, Luo Tanyang said coldly. Son of Heaven smiled and said, King Xuan is a stubborn girl. She doesn't like people to intervene in her business. Since she did not kill Han Sen, she might be upset if I did. What an unwise woman. Another henchman of Son of Heaven, Peerless Sword, said. It's her honor that you, bro, would chase her while she just puts on airs. If it weren't for you, I would have killed her already. Don't put King Xuan down. She is quite something in both God's Sanctuary and the Alliance. If she becomes mine, it will be a huge advantage to me. Son of Heaven said grimly, end of discussion. We need to get to Sunset Slope before Fiskai's gang. That sacred blood creature has to be ours. Han Sen returned to his room, tied the Copper-Tooth Beast to a cage and put the black crystal in front of it. The beast gobbled up the black crystal greedily. After an entire day, Han Sen noticed some changes to the Copper-Tooth Beast. Its fur had been gray-black like a wild boar, and its fangs had been bronze. Now its fur also started to show a bit of bronze luster, and the fangs had become brighter in color. However, this was not a true mutant Copper-Tooth Beast, which ought to look like a bronze statue. Although this one did show some bronze luster, it was still quite different from a mutant one. It seems that the evolution from a primitive creature to a mutant creature is a more complex process than from ordinary to primitive, so it requires more time than one day. Han Sen pondered. After more than 2 days, its bronze color thickened, but the Copper-Tooth Beast still didn't look like it was going to evolve anytime soon. Han Sen had to let the beast evolve at its own pace and go kill some primitive creatures for money. Plus, he could also use some primitive geno points. Even if one didn't choose to use the primitive geno points to complete evolution, the more primitive geno points one gained, the stronger the body would become. And the same went for ordinary and mutant geno points. If one could max out on ordinary, primitive and mutant geno points, one's physical conditions would still be far beyond the average level, even without evolution. With the Black Crystal, it wouldn't be difficult for Han Sen to max out on all 4 types of geno points. At the moment, he wanted to max out on the other 3 before he focused on sacred geno points. Han Sen left his room and walked into the shelter, feeling slightly different. Today the streets seemed to be a lot less crowded than usual. What's going on? Han Sen walked past the plaza and found fewer stalls there than usual as well. People there were all whispering something to each other. Han Sen listened for a while and started to figure out what had happened. A few days ago, someone had spotted a new sacred blood creature near the sunset slope. Somehow the 3 gangs in steel armor shelter all found out about it and gathered at the slope. But the outcome was terrible. The sacred blood creature ran free while a lot of men were killed. Today, King Xuan, son of heaven, and Fist Guy had reached an agreement to hunt the sacred blood creature together. They also recruited a lot of lone wolves in smaller groups, forming the largest campaign in steel armor shelter in recent years. The 3 gangs were determined to kill this creature. Han Sen suddenly had an idea, so he turned around and ran out of the city. When there was no one around, he summoned the black beetle beast's soul and covered himself in armor. After running for 2 hours, he came to a stone hill west of Sunset Slope. Having finally climbed to the top of the hill, Han Sen took a look in the direction of Sunset Slope. Among thousands of people fighting and yelling, there was a monster with the head of a cow, the upper body of a human, and the lower body of a horse. It was holding a double-edged golden axe and pushing its way through the crowd. No one could withstand the fierce blow of its axe. Han Sen happened to see the monster swinging the axe at Son of Heaven, who even had his blood-red sword. Son of Heaven did not dare to block the axe. He stepped on his own mount and leaped back a few feet. Roar! The monster's double-edged axe hit the Triceratops-like beast's soul mount and split it in 2 halves. That broke Son of Heaven's heart. A mutant beast's soul mount was very rare, with the same value as a small interstellar spaceship. How is this sacred blood creature so strong? Han Sen was shocked. The sacred blood creature ran and killed thousands of people in a flash, and no one was able to fight back. Even people as strong as King Xuan, Son of Heaven, and Fist Guy didn't dare to engage in a frontal attack. Hit by all sorts of alloy arrows and beast soul arrows, the monster still didn't even get a scratch. When it swung the axe, no one could get close. Such a mighty creature corresponded to Han Sen's impression of a sacred blood creature. The sacred blood black beetle he killed was way too weak compared to this monster. It was only a little stronger than an ordinary black beetle and didn't even feel like a sacred blood creature. People were expecting to trap the sacred blood creature, but now a key buffer was lost as the Mount of Son of Heaven was killed. The sacred blood creature was charging madly, waving the golden double-edged axe and leaving screams, blood, and limbs behind. It took it only moments to rush out of the siege to the mountain. At the foot of the mountain, it even smugly turned around and stood on its back legs, mooing like a cow before it ran into the mountain. It wants to escape. Son of Heaven furiously summoned a green eagle-shaped beast soul, which turned into a green iron bow in his hand. Then he summoned a fiery beast soul in the shape of a giant 6-winged wasp as his arrow. Seeing the arrow, King Xuan and Fist Guy exclaimed, "A sacred blood beast soul of a 6-winged wasp." They had joined force with Son of Heaven in hunting the sacred blood 6-winged wasp. Son of Heaven was the one who had launched the final blow. They just didn't expect him to be so lucky to have gained its beast soul. There were less than 10 beast souls known to people in the entire steel armor shelter, and many were left by those who already had evolved and gone to Second God's sanctuary. Son of Heaven, stop. It's a beast soul that can only be used once. If you failed to kill it. Luo Tianyang wanted to stop him, but it was too late. Son of Heaven had already shot the sacred blood beast soul arrow with a full draw. The arrow turned into a red lightning bolt flying towards the sacred blood creature. Bang! The sacred blood creature felt the imminent danger and turned around. The wasp arrow shot into its chest and exploded, bursting open its flesh. The monster fell to the ground, losing its vitality as its internal organs and blood sprayed out. "How dare you kill my mount? There is no way I'd let you live after doing that," Son of Heaven yelled loftily, standing like a king, leaving everyone in shock. While proud to see the crowd being impressed, including King Xuan, son of heaven suddenly saw a green shadow shooting down from the sky into the dying sacred blood creature and ended its life. A golden figure immediately rushed down from the stone hill nearby and approached the sacred blood creature, lifting the golden double-edged axe to his shoulder. The mysterious figure ran towards the mountain in a flash. Su Zhaoqiao recognized Han Sen's unique golden armor in no time and called out loud. Han Sen was hiding on the stone hill when the sacred blood creature charged in his direction. As he was deciding whether to retreat, he saw Son of Heaven shoot down the sacred blood creature. Anger surged and Han Sen rushed down the stone hill while summoning the bronze crescent spear. He shot the spear at the monster and hit it in the wounded chest, killing the dying creature. Sacred Blood Bloody Slayer killed. Sacred Blood Beast Soul Bloody Slayer gained. Eat the flesh of Bloody Slayer to gain 0 to 10 sacred Geno points randomly. The voice in the back of his head brought him intense joy. He had just gained another sacred blood beast soul. His luck was too good to believe. However, Han Sen did not have time to celebrate. The body of the Bloody Slayer was too large for him to take away, but what he could take away was the giant golden axe. The creatures in God's sanctuary could produce certain treasures through special means. People called these treasures gears. Although gears were just like solid items and could not be summoned like beast souls, they could perform as well as beast souls if they were produced by advanced creatures. The Bloody Slayer was peerless when holding the golden axe, and the axe could easily break normal beast soul weapons and beast soul mounts, so it proved to be an excellent sacred blood gear. Han Sen's goal was to get the golden axe, and the beast soul of Bloody Slayer was completely unexpected loot. Watching Han Sen running on the mountain with the golden axe, everyone was stunned. Mother Hashkur, son of heaven, let out a raging roar when he realized what had happened. With a black wildebeest summoned as his mount, he rode madly in Han Sen's direction. Behind him, his gang all raced off on their own mounts to chase Han Sen, roaring and rebuking him. Han Sen did not expect the golden axe to be so terribly heavy. With 8 sacred Geno points, he was already a lot stronger than before, yet he could still barely walk with the axe, not to mention run. The Bloody Slayer made it seem so light. How could I run off with such a heavy weapon? Han Sen looked back and could already see Son of Heaven and his gang only half a mile from him. Although it was too heavy to carry, Han Sen would never leave behind such an excellent sacred blood gear. He suddenly thought of his newly gained beast soul of the Bloody Slayer, took a look at it and suddenly cheered up. Type of sacred blood Bloody Slayer's beast soul, shapeshifting. Without thinking, Han Sen summoned the beast soul of Bloody Slayer, and a majestic shadow galloped out, looking just like the monster, only missing the giant axe. The beast soul ran towards Han Sen and was instantly integrated with him. His body was transformed into a Bloody Slayer, and the black beetle armor changed its shape accordingly, still fully covering Han Sen's body as a Bloody Slayer. After all, beast soul armor was not as rigid as man-made ones and could change according to the shape of the body. After shapeshifting, Han Sen felt so energetic that the golden axe was now nothing to him. Running with 4 hoofs, he also became incredibly fast. Han Sen surged up the mountain at full speed and disappeared, far outpacing the gang. Everyone was speechless as everything happened so fast. Many smirked as they watched Son of Heaven and others who were still chasing Han Sen. #T. Who was that guy? He's got some nerve jumping into the boiling pot. And what loot? In addition to the golden axe, he gained a sacred blood beast soul. Can you imagine how much it must be worth? You think you could buy a sacred blood beast soul just with money? Haha, Son of Heaven must be so mad. A sacred blood beast soul. It would have been his but was taken away. The arrow he used seemed like a one-off sacred blood beast soul. And what did he get in return for such investment? LOL. I'm just afraid Son of Heaven will lose his mind. Didn't expect there to be a sacred blood beast soul. How lucky that guy is. He could never have killed the monster alone. And a dozen sacred blood creatures may not even render a single beast soul. It just happened that he gained everything with the last hit. Who was that guy indeed? Is there such a person in steel armor shelter? I heard someone call him Doll, but not sure. Doll. Interesting name. After less than an hour, Son of Heaven returned gloomily with his gang. But people already knew it was impossible to find someone on the winding mountain trails. Son of Heaven immediately questioned Su Zhaoqiao when he got back. His exclamation dollar had been a mistake. Su Zhaoqiao had no choice but to tell him everything about how he met Han Sen, which wasn't very helpful since all he had was a name. Dollar. Son of Heaven didn't fully believe him, but couldn't do much as Su Zhaoqiao was in King Xuan's gang. He bitterly led his gang back to Steel Armor's shelter and locked down the shelter, swearing to find Dollar and cut him into pieces. Most people did not learn the name Dollar, while Doll became popular. For a while, Doll, Son of Heaven, Sacred Blood Creature, and Sacred Blood Beast Soul became the most popular topics in Steel Armor shelter. Han Sen was digging a pit at the foot of the mountain, planning to bury the giant golden axe there. Although he escaped the manhunt of Son of Heaven by shapeshifting into the Blood Slayer, there was a limit to how long he could shapeshift. As one of the most powerful beast soul types, shapeshifting beast souls could directly impart significant changes to a human body, which could be unbearable for those with weak genes. The stronger the creature one wanted to shapeshift into, the more genopoints and bodies were needed. In general, for primitive beast souls, the number of minutes the body could withstand the shapeshifting was equal to the number of primitive genopoints gained. No one could see a sacred blood beast soul if it wasn't summoned, yet the golden axe could not be turned invisible. The person he mainly had offended was Son of Heaven, yet the campaign was a joint one, and the axe should have been the mutual gain of all three gangs. Hence, Han Sen had pissed off all of them and could only bury the axe in that spot for the time being. If I could sell the giant golden axe, it should easily bring at least 2 million. Han Sen was still excited after burying the axe. A sacred blood gear was not as valuable as a sacred blood beast soul, but still considered almost priceless. If he could sell it, 2 million would be a small amount. As for the sacred blood beast soul, Han Sen had not even thought of selling. This was the bedrock of his survival and success in God's sanctuary, and it would be like killing the goose that lays the golden egg if he were to sell it. Returning to Steel Armor shelter, he saw Luo Tenyang guarding the gate with others. Everyone who tried to enter the shelter was interrogated. Han Sen had no fear as he had already buried the golden axe. A young man at the gate stopped him and wanted to do a body search on him, while Luo Tenyang said, "Why waste any time on that scumbag? How is it even possible that he would be Dollar? Get off." The young man pushed Han Sen away and turned to search other people. Han Sen looked at Luo Tenyang with a sneer and went into the shelter. Everyone in the street was talking about what had happened at Sunset Slope. Listening to people calling him Doll, Han Sen thought, "Damn Su Zio Kiao. Who told you to call me Doll?" He was happy to know that Son of Heaven was furious and strode back to his room. In another room, Su Zio Kiao stood in front of King Xuan, almost in tears. "Xuan, you need to believe me. I've told you everything I know. I really did not know Dollar, but only saw him once in Zephyr Valley and bought some swift mantises from him, which I gave to my bros as gifts. Just ask around if you don't believe me. They even helped carry the mantises back from the valley. I am not blaming you. I just want you to contact Dollar. Tell him I am willing to buy his sacred blood beast soul and gear, and ask him how much he wants." King Xuan said quietly, "But I really do not know where he is." Su Zio Kiao said sadly, "Then go find him. Don't let anyone know about this and go look for him secretly. If you manage the task, I'll reward you." King Xuan showed Su Zio Kiao out after she gave the order, not waiting for his reply. After he left, King Xuan frowned to herself. Who could Dollar be? Is he someone in Fist Guy's gang? Or was the whole thing orchestrated by Son of Heaven? If he really is on his own, can I get him on my side? If I can't, it would also be nice to purchase the sacred blood beast soul and gear. Almost at the same time, Fist Guy sent his men to look for Dollar in secret, trying to buy the sacred blood beast soul and gear from him. Although it was a joint action, the only one who suffered a loss was Son of Heaven. If it had not been for his sacred blood wasp arrow, the bloody slayer would have run away and there would have been nothing for King Xuan and Fist Guy. Now they could share some flesh of the bloody slayer, so it had gone well for them. However, Son of Heaven lost a mutant beast soul mount and a sacred blood wasp arrow, while being robbed of the sacred blood beast soul and gear. Anyone in his place would have been exasperated. The entire Steel Armor shelter was looking for Dollar, yet no one connected him to Ass Freak. Son of Heaven also put a price on his head, and even offered to pay a reward for any substantive information. The price was so good that even Han Sen wanted to offer himself for the reward. Primitive green-scaled beast flesh eaten. 1 primitive geno point gained. Han Sen squatted in the bushes, watching a deep pond near him while chewing meat jerky made from the green-scaled beast. Up until this point, he had gained 91 ordinary geno points, 26 primitive geno points, 0 mutant geno points, and 8 sacred geno points. The copper-toothed beast was still slowly evolving, so Han Sen could only go out to hunt some primitive creatures, hoping to gain more primitive geno points. Because the black beetle armor would draw too much attention, he could only go deep into the mountains where nobody goes, fearing that Son of Heaven would know where he was. Fortunately, God's sanctuary was so vast that there were many places where humans had never set foot. so it was rather easy for Han Sen to disappear. While staring at the deep pond, Han Sen suddenly heard a distant voice of a man and immediately tensed up. Soon, Han Sen saw a young man walking towards the pond in ragged clothes. He was covered with cuts and bruises all over and looked extremely tired. "Friend, there are iron-toothed crocodiles in the pool." Han Sen came out of the bushes and cried from afar. He meant well in warning the young man, but was also afraid that he might alert the crocodiles that he wanted to hunt. This young man looked very tired and seriously injured. If he drank from the pond without knowing the crocodiles were there, he could have gotten killed by the iron-toothed crocodiles hiding under the water. The young man saw Han Sen and became ecstatic. "What is this place? And how do I get to Glory Shelter?" he asked, staring at Han Sen. "Glory Shelter?" Han Sen hesitated, looking at the young man strangely. "We are in Techie's Mountains north of Steel Armor Shelter, and I do not know where the Glory Shelter you mentioned is. I have come so far that I'm now in the territory of another shelter." The young man whispered to himself, looked up at Han Sen, and said with an almost commanding tone, "Take me to the shelter." Han Sen frowned, as the tone of the young man wasn't very polite. Quietly he said, "You go south from here. If you don't walk too slowly, you can reach the shelter before dark. I have to hunt, so I can't accompany you." Han Sen was preparing to go back into the grass, not expecting the young man to suddenly hit him in the back. Losing balance and falling to the ground, Han Sen knocked his head on a rock and started to bleed. "What are you doing?" Han Sen covered his wound and stood up, glaring at the young man. "All I want is obedience, not bulls #T. Take me to the shelter." The young man looked at Han Sen coldly. "FHKU. Han Sen summoned his bronze crescent spear and poked it at him. "Rubbish basic spear skills taught in integrated compulsory education. Even though my beast souls were all ruined on the way here, scum like you can't compare to me." The young man looked at Han Sen contemptuously, raised one palm and slashed it at Han Sen's spear. The young man's hands looked nothing like hands of a man, but rather like they were sculpted out of a whole piece of white jade, giving off an incredible sheen. Crack! The beast's soul spear was cut in half by his palm as easily as a steel knife cutting through wood. Hyper-Geno art. With only half of the spear in his hand, Han Sen was horrified. Science and technology were of no use in God's sanctuary, but ancient martial arts played an unexpectedly important role. With all the Geno points gained, humans were able to perform some mythical ancient martial arts in the real world. Nonetheless, it wasn't the so-called Kai but the power of genes that powered the ancient martial arts. Hyper-Geno arts were deeply rooted in ancient martial arts, full of mysteries that couldn't be explained by science. Their practice methods were mostly monopolized by the upper class. The most advanced Hyper-Geno arts were the least accessible. For those who graduated from a public school of integrated compulsory education like Han Sen, Hyper-Geno arts were never an option. This is your last chance. Lead the way or die. Again, he raised the jade-like palm as if he was an executioner about to perform his duty. If Han Sen didn't comply, he would cut his head off. "Kiss my ass." Han Sen summoned the black beetle armor and covered himself, kicking the young man with a leg sweep. "You asked for it." The young man's face darkened, his jade-like palm chopping towards Han Sen's leg. Clank! Han Sen's leg was knocked away, and there was a white mark on the golden armor. The young man was also forced to step back from Han Sen's kick. Surprised, he looked greedily at Han Sen's armor. "Must be sacred blood beast soul armor then. A scum like you having such a nice thing is just a gift sent from heaven. Hand over your armor and I'll spare your life." Han Sen turned around and launched another kick in rage. The young man grabbed Han Sen's leg and twisted it, wrestled him down and came down hard on his back with a knee. Han Sen uttered a scream, feeling his spine about to break. Scum is always scum, even with a sacred blood beast soul. The young man continuously hit Han Sen on the back of head, knocking his head into a rock. He cried ferociously, "Surrender the sacred blood beast soul. It's not meant for scum like you, asshole." Han Sen's blood was burning. He suddenly raised his head and butted Zhu Longyan's face with his helmet. Blood splashed from Zhu Longyan's nose. He covered his nose and backed off. Han Sen regained freedom and immediately summoned the Bloody Slayer. The moment he turned into the monstrous figure, he threw himself at Zhu Longyan. Zhu Longyan kept chopping at Han Sen, while Han Sen ignored all the attacks from his tough hands and held him down tightly, the cow-shaped head knocking on his head. "Who is scum? Who the FHK is scum?" Han Sen knocked madly on Zhu Longyan's head over and over again. That will be all for now. I hope you find this story interesting. Leave a like, subscribe, and enable notifications so you won't miss the next part of this story. Have a wonderful day. Goodbye.